Hi, my name is Katie and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about all the Japanese books that I read in the month of January. So if you don't know, there's a readathon that takes place in January called January in Japan, and it's all about celebrating Japanese literature. I think the readathon takes place mostly over Instagram and Twitter. That's certainly where I heard about it and where I've been participating mostly. I wanted to create a video where I review the 10 books that I read by Japanese authors. Well, 9 by Japanese authors, 1 by a British-born author who's lived there for 30 years. So the first book I'll talk to you about is called I Hear the Sunspot, and it's by Yuki Fumino. I'm not sure who the translator is of this one, but it's basically a manga, and I read the first 2 volumes, and I really liked it. Actually, it was really sweet. It's about 2 male characters, and they have like kind of an unlikely friendship. So one of them is hard of hearing, and the other one is very like loud, and one of them comes across as quite aloof, whereas the other is like in your face. And so they're quite like polar opposites, but they form this really unlikely friendship, and it's quite pure and lovely. It starts off the louder student, because they're students at the time, and the louder student is taking notes in class for the hard of hearing student. And he does this in exchange for food, because he comes from a family where food is more scarce, and just kind of builds from there. But it was sweet and lovely. I would say the pacing was a little bit off for me, sometimes very fast, sometimes very slow, and I felt like in some manga and graphic novels and things, there's like quite like the use of space to like determine the pace of the reading, and I felt like that was kind of lacking in this one. But I still really liked it, and I gave it 3 stars for both volumes. So I would continue, but I accessed it via Scribd and then was locked out of ebooks. So I'm hopefully going to get that in some other form at some other point in time to continue. I think there's 4 volumes, and I think it's been adapted, so I'd like to kind of follow that through. The next one is probably one of the best known, and that is The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa, and it's translated by Stephen Snyder. This is a story of a housekeeper and a professor. Can you believe it? It is. But it's about the housekeeper goes to work at the professor's house, and the professor's had lots of housekeepers before, and they've been thrown out, and she manages to kind of form a little bit of a bond with him. He's somebody who has had memory loss caused by a car accident. And that's not described in any detail, but it is kind of referenced, just to be aware of. And so he has this memory loss, and he uses little notes that he sticks to his jacket to remind him of things, and one of which is that he has this new housekeeper. And so every day he comes, every day that the housekeeper comes, he checks his jacket to see that he's remembering it right. And the professor is a mathematician, so he's very, very intelligent. And he starts to form a kind of like, he kind of puts up with the housekeeper, and they don't really have any issues, which is good, because you're kind of thinking, is there going to be a lot of issues? But then he discovers that the housekeeper has a son, and he becomes very interested in this son, and he says to the housekeeper, well, your son shouldn't be alone after school. Bring him to my house, and you can look after him in my house. It's fine, it doesn't bother me. And so she does that, and the child starts to come there, and they start to form a bond, the professor and the child. And that is probably the sweetest relationship in fiction that I've read in a long time. It was so adorable. I absolutely loved it. And do you know what? It's one of those things where someone is so passionate about their subject, they start to make you passionate about it, and that's how I felt about the professor and his mathematician kind of status. Like, I was just like getting really engrossed in the maths of it. I was like trying to solve the puzzles, because there are a few little maths questions in the book, and I was getting all excited and trying to solve them and find out the mystery before it happens, which I was not expecting. I was fine with maths at school, and I enjoyed it a fair amount, but I wasn't expecting to be that kind of engrossed and excited about it. That says a lot, I think, about the writing and the skill of her craft that she shows in writing this novel. I really liked it. I would like to read more from this author, actually. She is one of my authors to read more of in 2021. I think a lot of her other books are a bit more dark from what I've heard and seen online, and explore more dark themes, so I'm a bit nervous about that, and I'm just kind of waiting to be in the mood for something a bit darker, I suppose. But I'm looking forward to doing that in time. So I gave that one 4 stars. And the next one I read was called Inside Mari, and it was by Shuzo Oshimi. And this was a manga that I read via Scribd again. And I didn't like this one, to be honest. It's basically about a guy, and he's an older guy, but he becomes very interested in this school-age child, and he follows her home often, right? So he's basically stalking her in the book. And when that started happening, I was immediately kind of alarm bells ringing. That was kind of creeping me out immediately. But then one day he wakes up in her body, but he is sexually attracted to her. So he's coping with feelings of self-attraction, I guess, and also being attracted to her friends. And I found that really, really difficult in terms of the theme of it. For me, that kind of age gap where someone is a minor in a book, to me, that's not okay. And I wish I had DNF'd this one. And in the afterword, the author does make it make more sense a little bit, but I just wish that there had been no age gap. Do you know what I mean? If there wasn't that element of it, I think I could have went with it a bit more. But for me personally, that's just something that I struggle with. And so I rated this 2 stars. On reflection, I probably would give it 1 star, but I just did not like it. I then moved on to reading Lizard by Banana Yoshimoto. I watched another booktuber talk about Banana Yoshimoto, and if I can find their video, I will link it below. But basically, they spoke about all of her works. I should say this is translated by Anne Sharif, or Anne Sharif, I'm not sure. But they spoke about all of Banana Yoshimoto's work, and they said that this was their least favourite, okay? And I picked up because the way they spoke about it made me think this could be my most favourite, because it's about fate, and it's about things happening, and it's about kind of reincarnation as well, and like the living of multiple lives, and those are themes that I am really, really drawn to. And so I picked this up thinking this is probably going to be a 5-star read for me. Sadly, it wasn't a 5-star read, but I did still like it. I rated it, I think, 3 stars. It's basically a collection of 6 short stories, all exploring those themes. And for me, the themes of like reincarnation and things were ones I loved the most, and was most drawn into. But I would say overall, I felt like the character development in this book is quite weak. And in total, I just felt like the whole stories were actually needed a bit more work and a bit more development. The last story is the longest, and that was my favourite. And I wondered if a novel by Banana Yoshimoto might work better for me because of seeing those themes and characters develop over time. I thought this could actually be one that works for me. And so I'm going to try and find a novel by Banana Yoshimoto. If you have any recommendations, I'm probably going to revisit that booktuber's video actually, so I'll have to hunt it down and find it, because they had read like all of Banana Yoshimoto's work, and so we're like a bit of an expert on that. But yeah, I did like it, but I didn't love it. I then read what was a reread for me, and it became a favourite again. So this was one of my favourites of last year, and again it is a favourite, and that is My Brother's Husband by Gengoro Tagami. And I don't know who translates this either, but this is a graphic novel manga, and it's 2 volumes in length, and it's basically about a Canadian guy who goes to visit his late husband's brother in Japan, and his late husband's brother has a little girl, and they've never met before. So he goes there to kind of reconnect with his late husband's family, and it's just an absolutely beautiful story about family, about love, about kind of acceptance. It's also got loads and loads of lovely scenes, like where they're eating together as a family, and where they go and visit like different locations around the town. And it's just so nice. Like, it's so filled with joy, and for me it's filled with like total comfort. I've heard other reviewers say it speaks to homophobia in Japan. I couldn't speak on that myself, I've never been to Japan, but I believe that to be the case. So that was quite an interesting kind of culturalism that I was learning through reading this. But yeah, this is, as I say, the second time I read it, and I loved it just as much. It's absolutely 5 stars. I want to buy a copy. Like, this is the second time I've taken this out of my library. I need my own copy now at this rate. So yeah, I look forward to doing that. And I would definitely recommend this if you're looking to like dip a toe into manga. Like this was my first manga I ever read, and it got me excited about graphic novels in general. And if you're curious to try those kind of things, this is one that I would recommend for sure. I then read The Girl Who Leapt Through Time by Yasutaka Tsutsu, and that was translated by David Karashima. And this is two novellas, and it's YA. So I've never seen translated YA before, so I was kind of quite keen to pick it up to see what that would be like. But the novella format with the YA, I'm not sure if it worked for me personally. I've never read YA novellas before, but yeah. So they're both stories are sort of about young people, and the first one is about time travel, and that's where the book gets its name from. And I just overall felt like they both needed more development. But I liked that there was like twists in the book, and I especially liked a couple of the twists. One of them felt like, whoa, where'd that come from? And I wish from there it had been developed into a full novel, because I just felt like there was so much more from that plot line that could have been drawn out, and I was really, really excited about it. And then it was like, oh, and the story's over. And I was like, oh, that's well frustrating, that's disappointing. And then the second one is more about like trauma and memory, and it's quite good from the point of view that it kind of talks to a younger audience about how fear develops inside you, and how fear can be linked to traumas and not necessarily traumas that we remember. And I think that's really good. What I didn't like about this second one was the kind of toxic masculinity themes. So one of the characters is heavily shamed for wetting the bed and kind of like mocked for not being male enough. And I didn't like that, and I felt like I wouldn't want my child to internalise those feelings. And so that was where the book sort of lost me completely, I would say. And I ended up rating it 2 stars, so it kind of fell a bit flat in the end. But I would be curious to read more translated YA, because I feel like a lot of YA is just, for me as an English language reader, is just available in English language first. So if you have any recommendations, let me know. And then I was looking for non-fiction, and I just happened upon this title in my library, and it's originally written in English, it's not translated, but it's a beginner's guide to Japan by Pico Ear. I think that's how you say his surname, I apologise if not. But he's basically a travel writer, and he's lived in Japan for 30 years, and so comes from a position of sort of being integrated into society. But he says that he feels like you're kind of always a bit of an outsider as a foreigner. You're always a foreigner. And he struggles to kind of understand a lot of Japanese culture. He kind of says basically what he has written about here, he's not fully convinced that he's got it right. Like, these are just like snippets and observations, and he writes them in these really short like vignettes, is that how you say the word? And they're just like really short pieces, tiny pieces of writing, and then he writes the occasional longer form, which would be 2 or 3 pages. And it kind of gives you, I think for me, coming from an outside perspective, this kind of gave me a little bit more insight to some of the fiction I've been reading, and to kind of understanding a bit more about Japanese culture. And from there, it made me like more excited to kind of learn more and maybe visit one day if possible. That would be amazing, travel restrictions permitting. And I think for me, what I really relate to as an outsider in Iceland is this feeling of like not ever really feeling confident that you know the culture enough to speak on it. Like, if I speak on Icelandic culture, sometimes I feel like, have I got that right? Am I overstepping the mark? And I did really relate to that in here. I also related to something that he writes about, and I'll read it to you because I think it's really quite interesting and might be relatable if you also live somewhere that's not your birth country. So he says, "When I arrived in Japan, I noticed and wrote about how the word for wrong was the same as the word for different. In truth, of course, it was I who had got it wrong, failing to understand the explanation a book had laid out. in effect, I was calling the Japanese wrong simply because they seemed so different. And that like really resonated with me. Like I even wrote an Instagram post just about this book just because of those kind of feelings that it was bringing up at the time. I would say that it's not stuck with me in the way I thought it might. And I don't know if that's just because it's just short pieces of writing. But still, I gave this 4 stars and I would recommend it, especially if, like me, you know relatively little about Japan and would be curious to learn, or if you like stories from immigrants or migrants living in other countries, I would say this one for that is really good in itself. So yeah, it was good. And then the final one that I read, and I just read this a couple of days ago, and it's called Colored Elegy, and it's by Seichi Hayashi. And I don't know the translator of this one either. One thing I will say with manga, I don't know how you find translators. I've really struggled to find translators of a lot of these manga that I've read. But this is, I think it was published in the 70s, and they say it was born out of like underground manga, which was quite interesting for me. I absolutely adored the art style on this. I thought it was gorgeous. If I can, I'll insert a clip just showing you a few little bits of it. But I just thought it was really, really stunning. The thing is, the topic is less interesting to me. So it's about a dysfunctional relationship. And I would say at times kind of an abusive relationship. Like there is a scene where one partner is physically abusive towards the other, or at least that's how it read to me. And I found that really off-putting. And the subject matter of it in general wasn't really for me. But I still loved the art, which is what kept me reading, and it's very like a beautiful like style, like just kind of black and white pencil pen drawing. It reminded me of times of a book that I read called Uncomfortably Happy, which I really liked. I read that last spring sometime. But I would say in Uncomfortably Happy, it's more like a sweet story. Like they have their moments of hardship and disagreement and things like that, but it was not quite the level of darkness of this one. And I preferred Uncomfortably Happily, which I think is written by a Korean author. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend. But I liked the art style in this. I felt like in the story arc, a lot of it was written was not drawn in, so it was like off-page action. And I don't personally like that. Like I like to kind of follow the arc the whole way through and see it all laid out for me. But that's just personal preference. If you like quite like more alternative, or I would say like edgy kind of artwork and storytelling and things like that, then you might like this. I think I gave it 2 stars in the end. So that was really all of the 10 books I read in January. As I said, my favourites were My Brother's Husband, A Beginner's Guide to Japan, and The Housekeeper and the Professor. I would like to read more from Banana Yoshimoto, but I'm just trying to figure out what to start with from what I have read. And as I said before, I would love to read like a full novel from her. So watch this space. Hopefully I'll have more recommendations for Japanese fiction for you later in the year, as I do really like Japanese fiction and want to read more of it. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.